Hello, my name is Sean Gilchrist, and I'm here to talk, as the title suggests, I'm here to talk to you about money. This is not an investment video. You'd be talking to the wrong person. This is about what money is, and I think the topic is important because in modern life, we've forgotten what money truly is, and that is fundamental to a lot of our problems we're facing. Everybody that's watching this would admit that almost every aspect of modern life is broken. Government's broken, politics is broken, public discourse is broken, and education and the environment is in shambles. Everything about us is broken, and money underlies many of these realms of modern life. I don't know if you want to call them facets or aspects or compartments of modern life, but there, like I said, there's government, politics, education, the arts, religion, and of course there's the compartment of technology and the new one we've created, the virtual realm. All of this comprises modern life, and most of these areas are utterly broken. But the important thing about money is that it underlies many of these aspects. It's so important that Christ talked about money quite a bit, more than many other topics during his earthly ministry. So money is a key component or foundation, rather, to many of these aspects of modern life, of civilization. And if our understanding of it is erroneous, of what money is, then nothing is really going to function properly at higher levels. But to get to my point, what we're going to have to do is go back in time. We're going to have to look at the origin of money, where it came from. Because I said in modern life, most people have a misunderstanding of money, but it's really a forgetting. It's a cultural forgetting of what money is. And there's reasons for that. But our ancestors knew what it was much better than we do, which is really strange because we fancy ourselves knowing everything and we have so much information, but somehow this understanding of what money is has been forgotten. And the ramifications reach into almost every aspect of modern life to their diminishment when we don't understand it. So let's review human societies from a long, long time ago to now. Early on, as everyone knows, we were hunter-gatherers. We lived in small groups. We hunted, we slaughtered animals, we ate them, we took their skins and made our clothing and our tents, etc. And there really wasn't what you would call trade back then, although there might be exceptions. There's some remote trade with flint and technology, mainly how to do things, but not a direct trade of goods. I call trade in that time of human development appropriation. You took it, if you wanted it, you took it from another group. You robbed them or you murdered them. It was appropriation. There really wasn't trade, and there also wasn't any specialization. Everybody in a group learned how to do everything from their, generationally, how to make tools, how to make spears, how to slaughter, how to butcher, how to cook, how to keep fire going, how to preserve fire through inclement weather, how to stay warm, how to survive, how to wage war. So knowledge was passed down like that, and there really wasn't trade. You appropriated what you needed by force. Slowly, when agriculture came into being, things settled down. People started staying in one place. With agriculture came an explosion in specialized skills, which became so numerous that no one group or no one person could master all of them. With the development of agriculture, you essentially had the specialization of labor. You had woodworking, you had to have carts, you had to have plows once the Iron Age was here, you had to have harnesses. Instead of hides and skins, we graduated up to textiles, which involved the shearing and cleaning and carding of wool fleeces, followed by spinning and then weaving, all kinds of skills that were not needed as hunter-gatherers, but in the villages of agriculture, you had lots of skills coming into place. You just can go on and on and on. I'm not an anthropologist. These are things you know already. But anyway, it was at this time, with the advent of agriculture and the specialization in skills, that trade took place for the first time. And there's no doubt that the first medium of trade, or rather the means of trade, was through bartering. Before the invention of money, people traded or bartered for what they needed. Say the basket maker and his wife needed sustenance. Maybe he'd take 10 baskets to the farmer and trade him those for 1 basket or a bushel of grain. And then to make that bushel of grain usable, the basket maker maybe would go to the miller and have him grind it into flour in exchange for maybe 3 baskets. Likewise, not every farmer could afford a team of oxen and a plow. So a farmer might ask someone with such a team to come and plow his fields, and in exchange, he promised him half an acre of his wheat crop. Everybody knows the barter system, and it still happens. And when it works, it's great. But it happens on Craigslist occasionally. You can see that. But there's just one problem with the barter system. The buyer, quote, the buyer and the seller have to want each other's goods. They have to be in need of them. The seller needs the buyer's good, but the buyer doesn't need the seller. Then they have to work something out. And sometimes you have to make a third-party trade or even a fourth party, and it gets pretty complicated. And that's why money developed. Something that everybody valued or would value or agreed to value could be used as a medium of exchange. It was also more convenient, of course. If you were a basket maker, you couldn't walk around shopping carrying a dozen baskets. They're very cumbersome. And if your product was a service like plowing or milling, you couldn't very well take that to the marketplace. People came to you. So money was developed, and it wasn't probably initially automatically gold and silver, but whatever people decided was valuable. The old comic strip BC, they used clams. Of course, that wouldn't work because they're not scarce. They're not scarce enough to possess inherent value. But anyway, money developed because of the barter system became too cumbersome. Gold and silver probably became the currency by default fairly quickly. 1, because of the scarcity, and 2, because of the inherent beauty of them. So here we are. Why did I take us back in time to look at the development of money out of barter? Well, it's because for the thousands of years, humankind used real money. The ethics and the values and the rules governing the use of money were derived from the practice of bartering. And barter was the precursor or the antecedent of money, and everything carried over from bartering into money. So right now I want to look at bartering in a little bit more detail. When tradesmen or workers went to barter, there were, of course, rules or ethics or values that governed the transaction. And in doing this, I like to use, obviously, the basket maker. And that's because the basket maker gathers his own raw material. When the basket maker goes to the marketplace or stops by at another tradesman and wants to trade something, he takes with him his baskets, of course. Say he can make 10 baskets, bushel-sized baskets, a week. He makes 2 a day for 5 days, and the other 2 days, he gathers his raw material from the marshes, from the woods, wherever he gets it. So the basket maker shows up to the tailor and is in need of a tunic. Winter's coming, and he needs something warm. So he will offer, or they'll make a deal based basically on how much labor, obviously, is involved in the product. These people back then, unlike us, who go to our offices and are shielded from everybody else because of our commutes, because of the way our cities are arranged, we don't know anything. But back then, they knew each other. They walked by each other every day. They would walk in the fields and see the farmer. They'd walk past the blacksmith and see him sweating and pounding on the iron. They all saw each other. They knew how much one another worked. They roughly knew how much time it took to make certain objects. But what determined the basis of the value of the basket maker's tin baskets or the tunic of the tailor is how much labor went into it, how much time went into it. And they knew that. So they would make a transaction. They would figure out the balance of their trade based on how much work went into the product. Everybody knows this intuitively, but the ramifications into money, we've gradually lost. We all know the phrase, the couplet, time is money, and the reverse could also be said, the money is time. We've also heard, those of us who have ever been to an automobile shop, a garage, have heard the term parts and labor. Well, the truth of the matter is, and economists would back me up on this, is that 100% of the cost of everything is labor. The mechanics divide it into parts and labor, but the part, the water pump that they purchased, there's labor behind that. There's labor behind the factory. And then behind that, there's labor behind the iron workers who make the iron and the steel that go into it. And behind that, the labor of mining the coal. So essentially, 100% of every product anywhere without exception is labor. Mother Nature doesn't charge us for the coal we take out of the ground. Mother Nature doesn't charge us for the iron ore. Mother Nature doesn't charge us for the reeds in the marsh that the basket maker weaves into a basket. Mother Nature doesn't charge us for anything. The 100% of every product's cost is purely labor, human labor, usually, and that labor takes time. We don't do anything in an instant. So back to the transaction between the basket maker and the tailor, the baskets and the tunic. The exchange they make is going to be fair and acceptable to both. But here's the idea behind their transaction. We know it took time, and time then was their life, much more than it is today. Say the life expectancy for these people in prehistorical times was 45 years. Say the basket maker's 35 years. He may have 10 years left if he's lucky. He might die next year in warfare. He might die in 3 years from tuberculosis. The plague might sweep through and wipe him out and the whole village. Or he could get run over by a cart. Life was very tenuous, and everybody knew this. So to trade away a week of his life for 10 baskets for something that wasn't fair is just not going to happen. They had to be acute businessmen. If he spent 1 week weaving these baskets, 1 week might represent a sizable portion of his remaining life. Who knows? Even if he lives 10 more years, that's 1/500th of his life. So labor equals time, and time is your life. When these tradesmen made these transactions, they were acutely and keenly aware that their time was limited. Even when money came along and the basket maker would trade 10 of his, or sell rather, 10 of his baskets for a couple of silver coins, he would hide them in the fireplace, put them under his mattress, whatever. But with money, they kept the same values, they kept the same perspective. He would know where their silver coins were, and when he went to spend them, he would retrieve them, and he would remember what it cost him. He would remember the week he spent making the baskets that he sold. The silver represented his time, and the time was his life. Let's use a more modern example to bring this point home. Say a thief, we'll go to pre-insurance times when homeowners insurance didn't exist. Imagine a thief breaks into your house and steals your wife's wedding set, her wedding ring and her diamond ring, and gets away with it. It's gone. What has he taken from you? The modern mindset would say, he's taken your property. But what has he really taken from you? Say it took you 3 weeks' wages to buy the wedding set. 3 weeks at 40 hours per week is 120 hours of labor. And if there's no insurance and it's not going to be returned, the thief has robbed you of 120 hours of your life. Pure and simple, there's no other way of thinking about it. Those 120 hours will never be returned. And for us here in the modern age, that's not a huge deal. We have a huge life expectancy and modern medicine, but to the people under the barter system thousands of years ago, 120 hours would be a very big deal. So besides voluntarily making a trade with your time and your life and someone taking it from you involuntarily, how else or what other entities do that to us or take that from us? And the most obvious one that comes to mind, of course, is the government in the form of taxes. We've heard it said that the only sure things in life, the only certain things, are death and taxes. And we all know why death is sure. But why are taxes so certain in life? Well, it goes back to the fundamental role of government. And it has ancient roots as well. Obviously, the most important use of taxes are defense. In ancient days, before nation states, people would voluntarily come under the umbrella of the protection of a baron or a landed person, a duke, whatever you want to call them. They had the money, they had the castle, they had the horses and the chainmail and the armor necessary to defend. And the village would align themselves with such a person because the alternative was the marauding bands of other tribes or invading Vikings, you name it. So, and if they didn't do that, they would be subject to murder, to death, or to enslavement and being taken from home. So to prevent that, they voluntarily made themselves little slaves to a lesser degree to this overlord. That was the lesser of two evils. And that was the origin of feudalism, really. But eventually, feudal kingdoms united and we came up with the nation state. But the primary function of government remained defense from external foes. And for instance, Queen Elizabeth I in England, she protected her subjects from invasion. And the Spanish Armada was probably the best example of that. But there were others. And thus it was that even into modern times, the primary function of government is protection from external foes. Of course, protection from internal foes and danger is also necessary. We call that law and order. You need laws to keep people from killing each other, to prevent theft, which we've talked about, and to maintain order. And all that, maintaining laws, having courts and judges, constables, whatever, all that takes money. And private enterprise can't fund something like that. So taxes are necessary primarily for those two functions of government: defense, protection from external foes, and law and order, protection from internal. And gradually we've added more functions to government. One can think of infrastructure. After the Enlightenment, and especially in the 19th century and accelerating in the 20th century, the government began subsuming more and more functions and more roles, some of which, such as education, had previously been functions of the church. I'm not qualified to give a whole philosophy of government in this lecture, and it's not my goal. But it's not at all difficult to imagine, under these original two functions of government, why our ancestors acquiesced to the imposition of taxes. First, in the form of feudal rents, they would give 10 to 20% of their crops to the Lord in exchange for protection. Later, under nation states, when our ancestors became actual landowners, they continued to pay taxes, first poll taxes, and then in recent centuries, income taxes for the common defense. These people, who were probably very jealous of their labor/time/lives acquiesced to the imposition of these taxes because there was no alternative. The invasion of enemies could destroy your farm, burn your crops, take your life. Chaos at home could also be destructive. So taxes were necessary then, they continue to be necessary, and they still are today. Unfortunately, something started to go wrong, especially in regards to taxes. In modern times, governments began assuming more and more roles and functions that they previously had not been involved in, and this accelerated. I had already mentioned the involvement in infrastructure, creation and maintenance of infrastructure, education, both higher and lower education. They became involved in environmental protection. I'm not saying any of these are good or bad. I'm just reviewing what they've done. Creation of national parks and wilderness areas, support for the arts, and even space exploration. So these are some areas that at least our government has become involved in. But there's one area that is much bigger than all of these combined, and this is the nefarious one. It's called social welfare. And what is social welfare? Well, with the original two functions of government, defense from outside and law and order at home, when government spent money on those two things, it applied to everybody. Everybody benefited, not one particular individual. But with social welfare, that changed. Social welfare is when the government spends money not on the general body politic, but on certain perceived disadvantaged groups. The trends in society which led to the development of social welfare, or one could say the roots of social welfare, are complicated, but I want to focus on a couple of the main ones, in my opinion. The first one was this fellow in the 19th century by the name of Marx. He preached class and class struggle as the underlying basis of mankind's existence on the earth. And that led to socialism and the perception that government can own the means of production and has the right to distribute them. The second route, which gave rise or enabled the development of social welfare in the 20th century, was this civilization-wide optimism that characterized the 19th century, the Victorian era. Everything was getting better. Science was making great leaps, which led to rapid advances in engineering, which in turn led to improvements in transportation and communications and medicine. Everything was getting better and at a quicker and quicker rate. So there was room to be optimistic, and it led to this progressive mindset that mankind is on the up and up, and we're going to solve all of our problems, and nothing's impossible for us. It was almost a Tower of Babel mentality. What was curious was that this mentality survived the Great War, the First World War, which should have poked holes in anybody's concept that mankind is perfectible and that we're in charge and we're going to make good. It did put it on pause, this optimism, and the pause was long, and it lasted until after the Second World War. But even the horrors of that war did not totally break this bubble, and it reemerged afterwards, especially in the 50s and 60s. People's memories are short. Actually, I shouldn't say our memories were short, our memories were selective. Just think of the suffering from the beginning of the First World War to the end of the Second, beginning with the misery in the trenches. You had the Armenian genocide, you had the crimes of the Bolsheviks, suffering from famines caused by collectivist experiments. And then in the Second War, you had the horrors of the Holocaust, of course, and the cruelty, especially on the Eastern Front. You had the barbarism against POWs by the Japanese, and then you had the incineration of civilians by nuclear weapons. And then somehow in the 1960s, politicians regained this progressive mindset that humankind is perfectible. Anyway, as incomprehensible as it may seem, that's what happened. The elites and the politicians of the 1960s, emboldened by recent successes, the defeat of fascism, the taming of the power of the atom, and putting a man in space, perhaps with all this, they felt invincible again. We're going to solve mankind's problems. It's in our power. So what did they do? The major legislation in the 1960s was the Great Society, and that included this grandiose idea of a war on poverty. So why did I use the word grandiose to apply to the war on poverty? Well, I really should have qualified it, because even thinking the way I do, not all of the war on poverty was bad. Under that umbrella were the laws, were the anti-discrimination laws, the Civil Rights Act, the equal housing opportunity, all that. Those were good in as much as those were legitimate roles of government to ensure that people are treated equally under the law, equal justice under the law. Those were good. But what was grandiose and took a lot of chutzpah by these politicians was to think that they could legislate giving money, giving benefits to people directly, and avoiding unintended consequences. That's pretty Pollyanna or pie-in-the-sky thinking. Why else was it grandiose for this generation of politicians to think they could eradicate poverty through legislation? Well, poverty has always existed in the human race, and it always will. It's part of the human condition. And for these politicians to think that finally they had the wisdom to eradicate it is grandiose. If poverty were something that could be legislated away, there were much wiser and greater generations of politicians before these, and it wasn't accomplished. So I'm going to try to avoid any political dead ends or sand traps, rather. But what was this social welfare legislation, and where did it go? Well, in the mid-60s, of course, it started out with Medicare and Medicaid. Head Start was thrown in there. There was aid to families with dependent children. There was the food stamp program, which, as I recall, later became, decades later, CHIP and now SNAP. There was Section 8 housing and the community development housing program. And then lately there was the earned income tax credit. One after another, social welfare programs came and expanded. And it's reached the point that the social welfare spending by our government pretty much equals the spending on the military, which is a legitimate function constitutionally of the government. But social welfare spending pretty much equals that. And that's saying a lot, because military spending itself is way too high, feeding the military industrial complex. So everything's ballooned. And the reason for the ballooning and the expansion and the greed behind it is another story that I won't get into, perhaps maybe in part 2 or part 3 if I get to those. The social welfare programs just kept expanding, both in size and number of programs with each decade, with a few hiatus here and there. And it became normalized, really. In fact, current generations like the millennials and Generation Z just take it for granted that that's part of government. My generation, the baby boomers, know it for what it is. It was an innovation and really a social experiment, which, if one looks at it critically, an experiment that has failed. Yes, as I said, social welfare has become normalized, and you'll hear very few people speak out against it nowadays. Prior to the 1960s, the majority of Americans thought that taking money from one group and giving it to another without consent was unethical, if not immoral. And it goes back to the beginning of our government and before. If you've never heard of it or never read it, you owe yourself to pause now or do it later, you need to read the speech called Not Ours to Give by Davy Crockett. Davy Crockett, of course, was a hero of the Alamo, and he was a representative from Tennessee to the U.S. House of Representatives. To give you a little background of this speech, the members of Congress were wanting to recognize a naval officer who had perished, and they wanted to award his widow $20,000. Davy Crockett opposed this on ethical grounds because it wasn't right. In fact, I'll quote him here, part of this speech, quote, "I will not go into an argument to prove that Congress has no power to appropriate this money as an act of charity. Every member upon this floor knows it. We have the right as individuals to give away as much of our own money as we please in charity. But as members of Congress, we have no right to so appropriate a dollar of the public money." Now, if you read the details surrounding this, you'll know that Davy Crockett had a little change of heart because in the years before, he had voted on some disaster relief. There was a fire in Georgetown, which it was near Washington, D.C., and he voted to give the survivors or those who had lost their homes some money. But he went home and met a constituent who gave him a good lecture about how that was wrong, and he wasn't going to vote for him again. And the constituent's speech, or as Davy Crockett recorded it, made him have a change of heart. And the speech itself shows the general mode of thinking in the nation at that time. And, there's some debate as to how authentic the speech was, how, especially verbatim, the way it was recorded. But it wasn't a modern invention. The speech was all written down and the details surrounding it in 1884 by Davy Crockett's biographer. So it's legitimate whether every tale is authentic or not. And some of you may think, oh, Davy Crockett, he must be a 19th century version of a MAGA man or something of that ilk. But nothing could be further the truth. He was a very upright man. He was one of the few members of Congress that opposed the relocation of the Cherokee people from their homeland along the Appalachians in the east to Oklahoma, which resulted in the Vale of Tears. That took place, I think it started under Andrew Jackson and then was continued under Martin Van Buren. And Davy Crockett, alone of the members from Tennessee, he opposed that. He was ardently against it. In fact, he, like modern people who say, if Trump's elected, I'm going to leave the United States, he left the United States because of that. And he moved to what was then the Republic of Texas. And that's how he ended up at the Alamo and was killed. But he stood by his principles. He also had a mind for ethics and what's right and what's not right, and he stood by them. So fast forward back to the 20th century. Unlike the 1830s, certainly at the end of the 19th century and the early 20th century, of course, socialist thought began to creep more and more into the public mindset, especially in Europe. And in the 1950s, we had Medicare dreamed up during the Truman administration, I believe. And then in the 1960s, the war on poverty, Lyndon Johnson. I'm not making a judgment call on any of these individuals. The progressive, no doubt, had good intentions with many of these, but we know what's paved with good intentions. These politicians probably had in mind, of course, the truth that many rich people are wealthy by dubious means, if not illegal. Not all of them, of course, but many of them. And contrary-wise, in the lower classes, not everybody's poor by their own fault. Some are victims of circumstance. So to the progressives, this felt like rectifying some injustice, this redistribution of wealth. But just as two wrongs don't make a right, neither do 3, 4, or 5 or 6 wrongs. In fact, they just make a bloody mess. Things end up worse than if we had just endured the first wrong with patience and submission. And no doubt these people and their leaders had good intentions, like I've said. President Truman and then Lyndon B. Johnson. Johnson especially, from what I know of him, was a decent man and had many good traits. But like all our leaders, he was also a flawed man. And so it has persisted up to this day, a broader and broader acceptance of social welfare. Today, embracing social welfare is most characteristic, of course, of liberal progressives. And you see it also in people of faith, liberal Protestants especially, Catholics of a more liberal trend. And I see it in some religious people who are quite traditional in other aspects, in the realm of morality and the place of the church in our lives. I see very traditional Christians who still have a favorable opinion of social welfare. And that puzzles me somewhat, which was one of the impetus for this video. I believe I understand what's behind their embrace and condoning of social welfare. It's no doubt based upon their heart for the disadvantaged, the dispossessed, and the exploited. No doubt faithful Christians who embrace this concept must feel that social welfare somehow, in a secondhand or offhand way, fulfills the gospel's teaching to feed the hungry, clothe the naked, and for those who are homeless, give shelter. But if that's the case, why did I open this section labeling social welfare as nefarious, which of course means wicked or morally reprehensible? It's because social welfare, although it may relieve a little bit of suffering, it may do some of those goals that Christians and progressive both hope for, may even sometimes function as a safety net, and has. But overall, the effect on our society, both on the individuals who receive it and society as a whole, has been overwhelmingly negative. And that's the subject of another video, as I've said. Judging a social trend or phenomenon or a social construction through hindsight is judging it in an a posteriori manner. But this video is about judging it in the a priori manner, looking ahead, judging it with logic and reason, and is it a good idea or not? The politicians in the 1960s either failed to do that or didn't listen to the ones who were making such a case. But that's the purpose of this video, and I'm just now getting to the crux of this video, so please bear with me. Okay, so here we go. If you're one of those Christians who accept or defend or condone social welfare, embark with me on a thought experiment, please. So for the purposes of this thought experiment, pretend you've been given the power to look at a person and know how long they're going to live. You see one person, they're going to live to be 55, another person, he's going to live to be 88, and you know details about their life. You've also been given the power to transfer portions of their life or sections of time of one person's life to another. So here's the first scenario in this thought experiment. On this one candidate, you see he's a man, he's going to live to be 88 years old, and he has no children. You also know of a woman in her 40s, single mother, has 3 children, and you know that in 3 years she's going to die of ovarian cancer. And her youngest will still be in high school. So with this new power, you decide, or at least consider, I'm going to transfer 9 months from the older man to the woman. And that will help. But before you can institute your plans, you have a little reservation and you say, maybe 9 months is too much. Maybe that's not fair to take from that man. I'm going to reduce it to 1 month. We'll transfer 1 month from the man and give it to the woman. But then you think, 1 month is not going to do much good for the woman. That's not going to help. That's not enough. So a bright idea comes into your mind. I will take 1 month from 120 different people who are in the category of the man. They're going to live a long time. They fulfilled all their goals. They've raised their children, and they don't need it. And the 120 single 1 month intervals will mean a lot to this woman. It will be 10 years. But then your conscience strikes you again. And you say, perhaps 1 month is too much to take from a person's life. Why don't I reduce it to 1 week? And if it's their last week, it'll just save them suffering, maybe. That's the justification. So instead of 1 month from 120 people, I'm going to take only 1 week from, say, 520 people, and I'll give it to this woman. That'll be better. She'll have 10 more years. She can raise her children, and the 520 people won't miss that week. So what do we call these scenarios? Since none of us can tell the future, and none of us have the power to transfer life even 1 minute from one person to another, these scenarios represent playing God. So what I'd like for you to consider, even if you have to pause the video and to think about it, is if it were in your power to accomplish these things, which some people would say is a good thing, if it was in your power, would you do it or not? Would you play God or not? So my question to you as to whether you would wield this power if it were offered to you or not has two answers. Either yes, you would, or no, you wouldn't. My contention is that if you do believe in social welfare and you say yes, you would wield this power to correct some of these injustices in length of life, then I would say your answer at least is consistent. But if you say, no, I wouldn't do such a thing, that's playing God, then I would point out that if you support social welfare, it's doing the exact same thing as the mind experiment scenarios. Because this whole video has reviewed the fact that your life is composed of a series of segments of time. Some segments you sleep, some segments you enjoy yourself, but many segments you're employed in labor. You're earning the money, which you in turn spend for property. So in these considerations, portions of your life, segments of time, periods you spend in labor, and the money earned thereby are all manifestations of the same thing. They're all equivalent. So let's put this in real terms. As far as social welfare, taxation, what's being taken from people. Let's just look at it. We'll say, I don't know what the average is, so I'm going to use the word typical. Let's look at a typical wage earner and taxpayer in the United States. Say a person makes $150,000 a year. He earns roughly $72 per hour. And let's say his average work life is 40 years from graduation to retirement. Let's say he works 40 years. That would work out to a total earnings before taxes of $6 million. Let's presume also a 30% tax bracket. I'll just pull that out of the air. 30% tax bracket earning $6 million would mean he's paid $1.8 million in taxes. And if we go back to what we discussed earlier, about half of federal spending is for social welfare. The other half is for military. That would put us at $900,000 or half of his $1.8 million in taxes. But let's be real conservative. Let's say that although he has contributed $900,000 to the social spending of the government, let's say he gets a little bit of benefit from that. Perhaps he owns stock in Kroger's, which accept food stamps. Perhaps in his mutual funds, he has companies which benefit from the social welfare state, whether it's food, rent, or what have you. So let's be really conservative and just say that only half of that $900,000 is directly contributed to state-sponsored charity. Let's say it's $450,000. Well, what is $450,000? If he makes $150,000 a year, then 450, of course, is 3 work years. He has contributed 3 of his working years of his career to the help of people he doesn't know. He did not consent to give it, and it was taken from him involuntarily. Or if you really want to be specific, instead of 3 working years, we'll use literal life hours. He only works 40 hours a week after all. So 3 years of working 40 hours per week is about 6,250 hours of labor, which works out to 260 days, or about 8.7 months of his life was directly spent in supporting people he doesn't know, which is pretty close to the 9 months we originally, in our first scenario, that the person said, oh, that's too much to take from a person's life. So taking this all together, let's look. Does the enactment of social welfare and carrying it out, does that fulfill the gospel of Jesus Christ? And I would say no, it doesn't. Look at Christ's parables. Look even at the parable of the rich man and Lazarus. The rich man lived in comfort and enjoyed his luxury, and the beggar out on the road, out front of his house, name was Lazarus. He died in his misery, scratching his sores. But if you read the parable or hear the parable, the judgment was not on the nation of Israel for not forcing the rich man to share his wealth with Lazarus. That was not the fault. The fault was with the rich man himself and his hard heart. Nowhere in Christ's parables or his teaching is a Robin Hood mentality advocated. Take from the rich and give to the poor. It's always the individual choice of helping your neighbor. And who is our neighbor? Everybody. I don't have time to go over, or I'm qualified to go over all the teachings and parable of Christ about the poor and about money. But here's one passage that will really strike you if you've never read it before, or if it's been a long time since you read it. I'm going to read it and then stop abruptly and let your mind fill in what you think should come next. The background of this is Matthew chapter 11. The background is that John the Baptist has been imprisoned, but Christ is still teaching with his disciples. And John starts to have some doubts because Christ has not freed Israel from the Roman yoke. So there's some doubts entering John's mind. So he sends two of his followers, two of John's disciples, to Christ to ask him some questions. So I'll start at chapter 11, verse 2. Now when John had heard in the prison the works of Christ, he sent two of his disciples and said unto him, Art thou he that should come, or do we look for another? Jesus answered and said unto them, Go and show John again the things which you see and hear. The blind receive their sight, the lame walk, the lepers are cleansed, the deaf hear, and the dead are raised up, and the poor blank. What was the rest of his sentence? Was it the poor had their needs met, or the poor had money given to them to supply their needs, or the poor are supplied money from the rich? No, it says the poor have the gospel preached to them. And then he finishes, and blessed is he who shall not be offended in me. So yes, Christ preached a lot and taught a lot about the poor and taking care of them. He talked a lot about their exploitation by the rich. But nowhere does he advocate taking from the rich and giving to the poor against anybody's will. Nowhere, nowhere, nowhere. And so the reason social welfare policies don't benefit the recipients, and they certainly don't benefit the givers, is because it runs contrary to the law of God. It runs contrary to his appointed order of things, that good works are from the heart and done voluntarily. God loves a cheerful giver. He does not delight in someone who gives against their will. And the whole thing is theft and corruption, so it cannot be blessed by God. That's why the social welfare system since the 1960s has not resulted in good things for the United States or for the demographics that have either received or given. And the last point I'd like to make about this theory I've had or developed about the equivalence between life and money, with time as the intermediary, is that it works both ways. And I'm thinking of almsgiving. The reason almsgiving is mentioned so much in the New Testament and is so approved by God is that when you give something to someone in need, whether it's money or property or your cloak or what have you, you are just like the other instances, you are giving part of your life. You are sacrificing whatever investment of time you have in that property or money, you're giving that to the person in need. Whether you're giving them an hour of your life or whether you're giving 8 hours of your life, or in some instances more, you are sacrificing just like Christ did for us, giving his life for us. Almsgiving is so precious for the very fact that I've made through this whole video that life is time is money. And when you give it, you're literally giving segments of your life to this person in need. And I believe that's the reason why God accepts this as good works from us, something we're able to accomplish. We know in John 15 that Christ said, no greater love hath a man than this, than he would lay down his life for his friends. Well, almsgiving is just laying down little segments of your life one at a time. So I went down this tangent of individual charitable giving, or what the church calls almsgiving, because I think it reinforces the thesis of this talk, which is that however you're relieved of your labor or your money, whether it's buying and selling it yourself or being taken from you by the government in the form of taxation, it's essentially being relieved of segments of your life. And therefore, other word pictures might come to mind, such as every time the government takes money from you in taxes, whether it's a legitimate or illegitimate function of government, it's similar to them just whittling part of your life away, like a block of wood. Or you could picture your life as a body, and they're inserting a trocar and pulling out a core. We already discussed in the early part of this talk how some of those slivers and cores that the government extracts are necessary, how they're the lesser of two evils. Without them, our security is gone. We could be invaded and you could be enslaved, or you could be murdered in your own home if there's no law and order. But the question arises, is it ethical for the government to take those slivers or cores and give them to another individual? And of course, the answer is no, it's not ethical. And in fact, all social welfare is fundamentally immoral. Our ancestors knew that, but we have forgotten it. And that concludes, I belabored this long enough, I believe, but I hope in perhaps a part 2 or part 3 to go over why we forgot it, what was the mechanism of our forgetting, also to look in hindsight at social welfare and its failures and how it's been damaging to the moral fabric of our society, as well as damaging to the individual groups and demographics that have received it, not to mention who have supplied it. So thank you for tuning in.